Hello and welcome, my friends, to Red Hoop Talk. My name is Shannon O'Loughlin, and I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the Chief Executive and Attorney for the Association on American Affairs. Association on American Indian Affairs. I almost forgot the most important part. Coming to you live from the homelands of the Piscataway peoples, what's now called Maryland. And let's see, the association, if you don't know who the Association on American Indian Affairs is, we are the oldest nonprofit serving Indian country since 1922. And you can find us on our website at indian-affairs.org. Thanks for joining us. If you're joining us from Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, let us know you're out there. Say hi. Tell us where you're from. And if you have a tribal affiliation, let us know who your people are. Really glad to have you sharing some time with us today. I was thinking about how to best open the show today, and I'm like, oh yeah, oh shit. It's like the 4th of July weekend, right? It's going to be a federal holiday on Monday. And what does that mean? And what we always get at the association is we get inquiries from press, we get emails, we get phone calls, always asking us, what do Indians think about whatever is, the holiday or whatever an event is or a happening. And so our latest inquiry is, well, what do Indians think about Independence Day? And so let me give a little 101 on this issue. So if you are asking, what do Indians think about something in particular, always know that the right answer that you're going to get is it's complicated. There is no one answer. And if you weren't aware, there's 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States and more than 300 other tribal entities and state recognized tribes that consider themselves sovereign with their own language, culture, relationship with the federal government, relationship within the states they reside, and they all believe things differently and diversely. So there's no one answer about what do Indians think about anything. So for Independence Day, I think what some general answers would be, and I'd love to hear from folks out there in the chat how they feel about Independence Day. On one hand, disproportionate or a greater number of our people are veterans of the armed forces than any other group. So comparing apples to apples, or maybe that's a wrong metaphor to use, isn't it? In a Native American show. But comparing American Indians and other groups, we have more people in the armed forces than anyone else. And so Independence Day is a special reminder of the people who throughout our generations have fought to protect our lands, not just your lands that you stand on, wherever that may be, but our lands that we have been put here to care for. And then on the other hand, so we may have good feelings about it because we protect our warriors and our veterans. But on the other hand, Independence Day is really hard because your independence, American citizens' independence, came at the expense of other people's independence. And so it's difficult to reconcile, especially in this era. And again, I would love to hear from you in the chat if you have an opinion or feeling about Independence Day, the 4th of July, and how you celebrate this time of the year. Maybe it has nothing to do with the 4th of July. Maybe this time is part of the ceremonies that your tribe follows. So yeah, Indians think differently about freaking everything. But I'll tell you one thing that we all agree on is that the things that have been taken from us, we want back. And that brings me to our show tonight, which I'm really excited to share with you. This is a special presentation from our 2026 Annual Repatriation Conference. It was a panel titled From Repatriation to Rematriation, Honoring the Ancestors and Their Seeds. And featured in this video we're going to be showing is SONYA ATALAY, who's Anishinaabe-Ojibwe and the Associate Professor of the Anthropology Department at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And a very good friend also is Shannon Martin, who will be in the video. She is an enrolled citizen of the Match-E-Be-Nash-She-Wish. Okay, I'm not going to say it again. A band of Pottawatomi Indians and descendant of the Oreilles. I'm just screwing it up, Shannon. I'm going to have you reintroduce yourself. I apologize for that. Of the Lake Superior Chippewa Indians, and also a friend, and this is going to be in a historic moment for Red Hoop Talk, David Michener. He's from the University of Michigan. He's the curator at the Botanical Gardens there. And David Michener will be our first white guy on Red Hoop Talk. So this is a historic show tonight. But I want to let you know that you're not just going to be sitting back watching a video. Oh no, we've got some special things for you tonight, because with us on this video are Miss Shannon Martin and our first white guy on the air at Red Hoop Talk, Mr. David Michener. Welcome, both of you, to Red Hoop Talk. How are y'all doing?
Fantastic.
Man, did I really blow up that introduction or what?
That's okay. It's that's a hard tribal name to say, and I remember, your colleague early on this year really tore that name apart.
That's right. Roy really messed that up.
Roy, and I don't know if we can say it on air, but he had fun with it.
Well, Shannon, if you don't mind, would you like to introduce yourself again?
Absolutely. Bujun and the way to Maniduk, Nungo Quen Deshnikas, Bijou and Dodem, Match-E-Be-Nash-She-Wish, Pottawatomi, Meanwhile, Curator, Lake Superior, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Quen Dal, Wabizheshi, Ziibiwing, Donjiba, Shaganashi, Mawin Mijima. My name is Shannon Martin. I'm a Lynx clan and an enrolled citizen with the Match-E-Be-Nash-She-Wish band of Pottawatomi Indians, or the Gun Lake tribe, and that's from my mother's side. And then I'm a descendant from the Curator band of Lake Superior Ojibwe, or Chippewa Indians, on my father's side. And I currently live in the homelands of the Gun Lake Pottawatomi, and where I was born and raised. So happy to be on this evening, and always a pleasure to visit with you, Shannon, and glad to be here with my good friend David and making history with you tonight. So we always love our allies and our white guys. So
yes, and David is a true ally of Indian country. David, would you mind so much telling us a little bit about yourself? And welcome, by the way. Thank you for being our first white man on our show.
And you got a really pale one, but one who also has hair underneath it all, because I always am assumed that I'm really vain about it. So I'm David. I'm ninth generation settler colonist of mostly Northern European background. And I was born in the Central Valley of California, but have been here in Michigan for 31 years now. And I think I met Shannon Martin about maybe 15 years or more ago, but we really started interacting in the last decade or so. And so I'm the curator at the Botanical Gardens, which stewards 4 properties of land in southern Michigan, all in Pottawatomi territories, although the university doesn't necessarily view it that way. And about a third of all the native vegetation of the state is on these lands. So although the public knows us for two particular display garden areas, we're actually much more being in Michigan oriented than that. Right. And we're one of 18 museums on campus. Well, so back to you, Shannon's.
David, I actually think it was 21 years ago, because we were causing some good trouble at the University of Michigan regarding their secret society called Mishigama that existed back in the day.
And thank goodness for your actions around that, Shannon, with others.
Well, the hell, what the hell is that? That sounds like a whole nother story that we need a show for. What was that?
Yeah, that's a whole nother show. It started out as a men's elitist secret society that was initiated in 1902, and they tapped 20 of the most elite men on campus to be a part of the Mishigama tribe, where they gave themselves bastardized Indian names like Flip 'em Back Gerald Ford, meaning flip 'em back, and they used the stereotypical poor English early Hollywood movie Indian language for their naming ceremonies.
Holy
cow. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So we're not surprised, but always just disgusted.
Yeah, David and I had some runarounds with that back in the day in the late 90s and into 2000. So
wow.
We have a wonderful history, but now we're working on really amazing things together to free the seeds.
To free the seeds. And before we get to freeing the seeds, I want to know, David, why are you wearing an orange vest today? Is there traffic coming? What's happening?
It's in honor of all the missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, which have been known from the first day of it, even preceding the original Independence Day to today. And it's known by all their families, their peoples, their relatives, human and otherwise. But the majority culture is only now acknowledging the uncontestable reality that this happened and continues to happen. So it is in their honor and respect and an awareness. Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, David. Thank you. All right. So we want to bring in this wonderful video that you both and SONYA ATALAY were a part of in presenting at our last year's repatriation conference. Is there anything you want to do to kind of intro it before we get it going?
I'd like to just acknowledge, that the work with freeing the seeds began with our ancestors through the work of the National Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Through consultation with the University of Michigan and their officials, began the conversation and the simple question that was raised by Kevin Finney of the Cultural Lifeways Institute and my mother, Sydney Martin, who is the NAGPRA representative for our Godlike Pottawatomi tribe. The simple question of, are there any seeds in your collections? And that simple but beautiful and powerful question began to open up cabinets. It began to open up doors and minds and knowledge and our blood memory to begin this important work to rematriate these seeds from within the plastic housing and shelving that they're currently stored in the ethnobotanical ethnography collections at the University of Michigan.
Beautiful. David, do you want to add anything?
To me, it's a continuum with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and children. Why is so much of the culture retained here? How they're not things, they're not objects, they're far deeper. English doesn't have a good framework for this, but how do they find their people?
Right, right. I think that's really well said. So, well, let's get into it. So what we're going to do tonight, everyone, is we're going to welcome your questions in the chat. We're going to be interacting with the video live. So if I have a question for David or Shannon, I'm going to pause the video and we're going to talk a little bit. Or if Shannon and David want to pause the video to add something that they might have missed during the presentation, they're going to do that. So we're going to have fun with it and it'll be interactive. And we welcome you all to join us in this conversation about repatriation to rematriation and returning the ancestors with their seed. So let's get started, yeah? Okay, so I'm going to bring this puppy up. And the beginning of it is a little boring because Anna Matthaei is introducing you both. So it's, you know, kind of a nice formal introduction.
Thank you for joining us for this plenary session entitled From Repatriation to Rematriation, Honoring the Ancestors and Their Seeds. Dr. SONYA ATALAY, Anishinaabe-Ojibwe, is an associate professor in the Anthropology department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's an archaeologist who works in partnership with Native nations to carry out community-designed research projects. She's co-authored a series of research-based comics about the repatriation of Native American ancestral remains, return of sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony under NAGPRA. She served 7 years on the National NAGPRA Review Committee that oversees compliance with federal NAGPRA law and has written about healing from historical trauma that can come from repatriation. She is currently writing a book called Braiding Knowledge, which looks at how Indigenous knowledge systems are challenging and changing universities and other institutions. Shannon Martin, Lynx Clan, is the director of the Ziibiwing Center of Anishinaabe Culture and Lifeways, the Midwest's premier award-winning American Indian museum. Shannon leads a team that addresses cultural and historic preservation, repatriation, and reburial of ancestral remains, artistic expression and promotion, tribal collections and archival conservation, cultural resource management, exhibition development, protection of intellectual property, and stewardship of Saginaw Chippewa tribal cemeteries, burial grounds, historic properties, and sacred sites. Shannon serves on the Advisory Council for the Darcy McNichols Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library and the Research Advisory Council for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Dr. David C. Michener is the curator at the University of Michigan Matthaei Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum, where his team is internationally known for its work in conservation of historic peonies. Curation also includes stewarding lands, plants, and ecosystems that are homelands for the Anishinaabe tribes forced into exile and diaspora. The best stewardship programs for the climate change ahead can only come through mutual respect, engagement, and work, a distinctive strand of engaged tribal university scholarship deeply embedded in reconciliation. Thank you all for being here today. I really look forward to your presentation. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Obuju, Nindawena Mani Duk, Nungo Kwandishnikas, Bijun Dodem, Match-E-Be-Nash-She-Wish Pottawatomi, Minwala Courte Superior Ojibwe Anishinaabe Kwendo, Wabizheshi Ziibiwing Donjaba, Minwa Saginaw Ojibwe Anishinaabe, a king in Donjaba, Shaganashi Mwin Najima. Minokishep, good morning, my relatives. I am coming to you from the Aboriginal territory of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. And I would like to say miigwech to the Association on American Indian Affairs and the University of Denver for the amazing job that they have done this past 10 months in pulling together this opportunity for us to gather. because we know that the work of repatriation does not stop. And we are thankful that they've provided a platform for us still to gather during this hardship time that we're in.
Aho, bonjour, Minogjet, Boshking Ungo Queen, Indigenous Anishinaabe-Ojibwe Queen and Dao, Wabizheshi and Dodam, Matthaei Queen and Dao. I greet you in my traditional language, Anishinaabe-Moin. I shared my spirit name, my clan, and my tribal affiliation. And I'm here greeting you today on the traditional homelands of the Kumtuk peoples and the communities of the Nonotuck and the Norwatuk peoples. And I want to acknowledge them and their relatives, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc, and other nations who continue to be caretakers today of the land, waterways, and the other than human relations in these homelands here in the Northeast. I'm SONYA ATALAY, Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at UMass, and I'm also the co-chair of the UMass Native Advisory Council. Very pleased to be here with you all this morning, with gratitude to the other speakers who are presenting in this panel and all of those who are engaged in this conference. And thank you so much to the AAIA for their great work over the many years, and all of you out there who are doing this important work for our ancestors. Miigwech.
Bonjour. Hello. I'm David Michener, colonial settler background for 9 generations on all 4 of my grandparents' sides. I want to start by acknowledging that we are here in Ann Arbor on the lands of the Anishinaabe peoples, past, present, future. And that the way forward has to be that way, openly, with the stewardship and guidance of those who know their homelands and their kin who are in the university museums. I want to give special thanks not only to the organizers, but to Elder Pavlot for the opening prayer. Miigwech. Thank you.
So I'm going to do my best to share my screen and see what I can be able to see that okay. All right. See if I can get it to presenter view. Yes. Okay. You all still see that? Okay. All right. So with that, I will turn it over to Shannon.
Well, again, good morning. I'd like to first acknowledge also the other 2 partners I have here at the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe who have taken on the responsibility to carry out NAGPRA work on behalf of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. My brother, William Johnson, or Willie, as the curator of the Ziibiwing Center, and then our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Marcella Haddon. And we 3 work together to carry out the important and sacred work of NAGPRA for the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. So our work in moving this forward, we always have to look behind us and reach behind us. And in order to do that, we look to our spiritual and faith keepers, we count on our tribal elders, and we count on the voices of our ancestors who oftentimes will reveal and work through us if we listen. And the work that we're doing now with repatriating or rematriating heirloom seeds from the University of Michigan's ethnographic collections began from an elder's voice, and it's moving forward because of the ancestors are calling us to do this work. And when I refer to the ancestors, it's not the relatives, the human relatives that we have, that we rely upon as our relatives, but also the seeds. We believe the seeds are more ancient than our human relatives. In Anishinaabe teachings, the seeds were carried in all four directions in our creation story. And these seeds were here before humankind even existed. And it was in that great master design that we know how important they are, because for without seeds and without water and without land, humankind could not exist. And the work of repatriating our ancestors fits within that beautiful design. And it's why it's so important for us to bring them home, because they have been disturbed from giving their physical bodies back to Mother Earth to reseed the next generations. And for Anishinaabe people, that sacred ceremony was interrupted. And in that interruption, we see that our communities sometimes lose important and valuable and spiritual connections to our ancestors' way of life. But when we take on the responsibility to repatriate, it brings so much more when we do this work. And our elders tell us here in this part of the earth that it's a blessing when we're able to bring our ancestors home and recommit them back to the earth, to marry them back to Mother Earth, so that that interruption can now resume for them. And with that comes blessings and gifts and knowledge that they want to share with us to our communities. And it's an act of sovereignty, it's an act of healing, it's an act of reclamation. So moving forward, we have to always reach behind us and bring forward what they intended for us. So as we continue to tend and nurture the repatriation of our ancestors, we are now moving forward towards the rematriation of our ancient ancestors, the seeds. So we ask, what's next?
To fulfill the intent of NAGPRA requires decolonizing museums. So my colleague, Amy Lonetree, wrote a fantastic book on this topic. She was invited to be part of this panel today, but wasn't able to join us. But decolonizing museums requires indigenizing minds, practices, policies, and relationships. Indigenizing involves bringing indigenous science, knowledge systems, and ways of knowing into museums, universities, state and federal agencies, and other organizations. So I'm finishing a book right now called Braiding Knowledge that demonstrates how indigenous knowledge systems are challenging and changing universities and other institutions. So braiding these indigenous frameworks into our current practices, it's an essential part of a larger project of decolonization. As Tuck and Yang in 2012 state in their often cited paper titled "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor," they say, quote, "Decolonization is repatriation of indigenous land and life." Museums and universities that hold our ancestral remains, as well as the bodies of many other Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, are founded on Western ways of knowing. In our experience, we found that successful repatriation involves indigenizing, bringing indigenous knowledge systems into the practices, policies, and ways of engaging in NAGPRA work. What indigenizing does is bring relationality to the center. Braiding our indigenous knowledge frameworks into the policies and practices of institutions results in powerful interventions. We're going to talk about some of those from our experiences today. It disrupts the structures that for so long have been solidly built on Western knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge plants seeds in places which emerge, grow, and entangle themselves throughout university and museum structures. What can result are practices that are regenerative rather than what we've seen previously, which is extractive. So National NAGPRA and others have provided clear data for us on the museums and the agencies which have the largest collections of ancestral remains. We can see some of the numbers here in this slide. And this is data that was compiled by National NAGPRA and put into this image by AAIA. National NAGPRA has more data that they've compiled as well, and you can look on their website and reach out for more info. And you can just simply see the staggering numbers at these top 13 problematic institutions, seeing and the large issue of non-culturally affiliated as these institutions have them listed. But there's what's not here and what you can't easily see on this slide, and what they don't reveal are that there are large collections that are termed repository collections that may not even be in these inventories that we also need to be aware of. So repository collections are oftentimes not as easy to identify. So these are ancestral remains that are
All right. I hear there's a question, David.
This is such important work, but I want to remind everybody that what's being presented here with human remains and culturally affiliated funerary objects is required information under federal legislation. Seeds and other kinds of cultural matrimony and patrimony are not mandated under the law. And so this is a really complex arena to get into, because one can meet with resistance in recalcitrant institutions because there's no requirement to answer beyond what is, however they view one as a researcher. And I just want to point that out as one transitions, because I think to all of us here in this chat today, this presentation, Red Hoop Talk, view them as all integrated and at the same level of ethical clarity. But the institutions that want to be recalcitrant are going to view it quite otherwise. Be courageous, keep going.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point, David, because NAGPRA applies to human remains, funerary objects, sacred items, and objects of cultural patrimony. And those items are defined by federal law. Sometimes tribes will push those definitions with institutions to try to have a broader meaning like cultural patrimony potentially being items that could include seeds or could include language tapes or other types of documents and items. These belong, the definition of cultural patrimony are items that belong to the tribal nation as a whole. They're communally held versus items owned by an individual. So to me, and of course the way we look at it, is that seeds would fall into items of cultural patrimony and therefore be NAGPRA would work. But you're absolutely right. How many institutions out there do you think take a view that's similar to our indigenous thinking about this?
From my perspective here in Ann Arbor, it's mighty few. I know we've interacted with the central administration of UC Berkeley about the Patty Hearst Museum only in the last 9 months, as there's a change going on there. But I also I don't know of many, and I certainly, for botanic gardens, this is almost unheard of, but that's because the seed collections are at the Natural History Museum, a very strange thought, or the Anthropology museums rather than at the garden. So the Western Academy fragments by disciplines all these different elements that are continuous from a cultural perspective of the people. And so a curator at one place won't even know there are elements at another museum on the same campus. And I have asked anthropology colleagues here and at other institutions, and there is not even a common list or website of institutions that have ethnobotanical seed collections. It's all professional word of mouth.
Wow. Shannon, what have you found?
Well, I think that's why it's important that we sort of, scream this from the rooftops as much as possible. So appreciating, the opportunity again to talk about seeds because they are so important to the tribal well-being and health of our communities. And when we've had ancestral seeds that have not been planted in our communities for 100 years or more, that's tragic. So for us to be able to share this information, encourage our brother and sister tribes to ask those questions when they're in consultations with institutions and federal repositories, or with even their local historical societies. There were seed banks in our counties and townships that our great grandmothers started. And those seeds may still be in somebody's attic or in their basement. So it's important that we continue to sound, this message for tribes to ask that question. Do you have any seeds within your collections? Because it's so important for us to get these back, especially in this day and age when, Monsanto is genetically modifying seeds so that they only can be planted once. And those seed offsprings are not viable, which is, it's about power and money again. So we have to take control of what we can and bring these seeds out of the collections and into the ground. And that doesn't mean we're going to clear the shelves. It means there'll be collaborative efforts working together to grow the seeds, to rematriate them, and then to exchange them back and make sure that, we replace what we take. So those are ways that we can, work together with institutions moving forward to preserve ancient heirloom seeds so that they remain sacred, whole, and unmodified. But another institution that is following and has done good work, just like the University of Michigan, is the Field Museum. They recently repatriated seeds to the Meskwaki Nation. So it's happening, and we're thankful that it's happening, that the major institutions are allowing these seeds to go back into the earth.
That's great. Yeah, David.
So Martin spoke about power and money. And isn't it always amazing, breathtaking, how the powerful claim to have no money?
Good point. It is. Yeah.
So one of the elements here was thinking differently, which Shannon, Martin, and others have helped me greatly with over these years. So we approached the Graham Sustainability Institute, a funding unit within the University of Michigan. You'd think sustainability, that's more about all kinds of engineering and other things. And they immediately saw that funding to the tune of $10,000, the travel and consultation meetings for tribal partners to come here to see the seeds, to meet with the museum staff, and to begin to figure a way for the seeds to be rematriated was part of sustainability. This was not funded primarily through the museum, though the museum did help, as did the gardens. But it was finding another party that sees a different way. And so to me, even in an institution that has partners that are trying to work, it's finding those who are powerful, who have the money and understand.
Very good. We've got a question here in our chat. What kind of seeds? What kind of seeds were there at the Botanical Gardens?
So since it's asked about the Botanical Gardens, and we're going to come up with this later in the talk, but let me just so you're aware as it's coming. None are at the gardens. They're all at the museum. And I'm not a curator at the museum, but as a parallel curator, I can ask their curator and staff and director about it. And we'll get into some nuance there. But there are over 4,000 seed lots of Native American seeds at the University of Michigan. That's 4,000, and some of them are sets of corns, mondaments.
Mm-hmm.
All of them to community, dated, whose garden, information as that.
Wow, that's wonderful. Well, should we get back into it? All right, let's get back into it.
Held by federal agencies. Sometimes they may be in the possession of federal agencies, but very often federal agencies have legal control of these ancestral remains, but it's the universities that have possession. So this is often from excavations that were done, the federal agencies got the permits, the universities may have done the work, have possession of the ancestral remains, but many times universities and museums aren't including these remains in their inventories. So they become, in a sense, they're very hard to see these data revealed in these numbers that we see. So, and the Fed agencies often, Bureau of Indian Affairs, that's one of the biggest federal agencies. Army Corps of Engineers, has the largest collections. U.S. Forest Service, that's just a few. So universities then act as a repository for these remains. They don't have the ability to make legal decisions, but they do have possession. And so an important thing to do if you're facing this is just think about when you're working with institutions, with museums and universities in particular, is to ask questions such as, ask if a museum is acting as a repository for a federal or state agency. If the remains that are in the inventories are all the ancestral remains that are in their possession, or if they're, again, if they're acting as a repository for remains that are from a federal agency that they have in their possession, but they haven't listed in an inventory. According to what the law says, you need to have these in an inventory, whether you have possession or control. So these should be in inventories, but what we find is they are often not. So what we're going to talk a little bit about today is kind of a national strategy that we've seen work for how to get reluctant institutions to move forward. But I think what we also need is to develop a national strategy for how to get these federal agencies to move forward, because oftentimes these federal agencies can be quite reluctant as well. So looking forward on NAGPRA, I think that's a really important thing we have to think about is what are some of these strategies for moving forward with federal agencies and addressing repository collections. As I said, we're going to now talk a little bit about some of the clear and proven strategies that we've seen for engaging with reluctant institutions. Shannon and I will share a little bit about the story and what we've worked on at the University of Michigan case. And I'll turn it over to Shannon to get us started.
Yeah, so it was amazing to watch the comment stream yesterday during a session I was in which there were many university students who were asking, what can we do? How can we poke and prod at a university that is holding collections, holding our ancestors and their belongings? So as we move forward, there are many cases across the country that have worked with some of these bad players. But SONYA and I and David have an experience right here in Michigan at the University of Michigan. And this story goes back to the early 90s. So NAGPRA passed, and it was amazing to hear, Auntie Suzanne last night during the keynote talk about the victory of NAGPRA, and tribes were celebrating, but didn't know what they were celebrating. NAGPRA passed. Wow, now what does that mean? So, that was the situation here in Michigan. And these universities and repositories hope that would happen, that they would have more time to drag their feet, to not consult with tribes. Many of them, deemed sending one letter to the tribal chairman or chief at the time was called consultation, and closed the file and closed the books on that and said, well, we've done our part. University of Michigan was one of those places. One individual, Dr. John O'Shea, was in charge of the Great Lakes collection. He was the NAGPRA compliance officer for the University of Michigan. Many years passed from 1990 until tribes really were able to get into the door at the University of Michigan. SONYA and I, our story begins in the early 90s, 93, 94, 95. When we were students at the University of Michigan, we were undergrad students. The Native American Student Association was poking and prodding at the Museum of Anthropology and at Dr. John O'Shea and at the administration and asking, when are you going to consult? When are you going to work with tribes? We haven't seen any action happening on this campus, and we have, this university holds one of the largest collections of our ancestors. So when is that going to start? And as students, we knew we didn't have power to move the university to do this work. But what we did have was the power to continue to pester them. We pestered and pestered. And it wasn't until 1996, 97, and 98 when the Birch Island Ojibwe from the Birch Island First Nation began coming in delegations to the University of Michigan, demanding the return of ancestors that were taken from a sacred site. And it was at this time that we as Native students, as Native and non-Native faculty, as staff of the University of Michigan, and allies began to formalize a coalition to be more aware of NAGPRA and to continue to poke and prod and press at the university to fulfill their legal obligations under NAGPRA. It wasn't until 2000 that a chairman of the Native American Student Association addressed the Board of Regents. And it was during that 5-minute public commentary address, which echoed throughout the university and echoed throughout the state of Michigan. He commended the regents and he said, I want to congratulate the University of Michigan and congratulate all of you, for you have the highest number of Native Americans on this campus. And they paused and looked and kind of sat up proud in their seats. And he goes, more than half of the population here are our dead ancestors. You are holding them in boxes, on shelves, and there is no movement as far as this university consulting with tribes on the return of these ancestors. So that echoed true, and it echoed loud and clear, especially here in Indian country in Michigan. And I left the university as a staff person, was kind of forced out in 2000. And I vowed to SONYA, because we were still communicating about University of Michigan. We wanted our alma mater to do right by our people. And we both said, we'll be back. We'll be back. Just wait. So it was during those years that I moved up here to Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan. And we were awarded a consultation documentation grant. And our founding director here at Ziibiwing, Bonnie Echtel, was the founder of the Ziibiwing Cultural Society. And their bedrock, their foundation was to address NAGPRA. So once we had the Ziibiwing Center built and it was open to the public, we began the NAGPRA work and put that and placed it at the center again of what we do. And the consultation documentation grant with between the Ziibiwing Cultural Society, Ziibiwing Center, and the University of Michigan commenced from 2005 to 2007. And SONYA was a consultant on that case, and she and I can both attest consultation to the University of Michigan during that 2-year grant period was 1 hour meeting at the Museum of Anthropology under Dr. John O'Shea's watchful eye. They pulled associated funerary objects they wanted us to see, that they wanted us to comment on so that they could take notes. We had 1 hour. We were given 20 minutes with our ancestors where they were stored. During that 20 minutes, we were not allowed to offer tobacco. We were not allowed to offer a song. We weren't even allowed to smudge outside of the building. So this was the treatment and the consultation that they deemed fit for us. Well, we finished the 2-year grant and submitted our response and our investigation, our own investigation. And we were promptly given a 1.5-page letter stating that the 3 sites that we were claiming cultural affiliation for the return of our ancestors, they let us know that you were not affiliated. Therefore, we are denying your request. So that began the coalition that was kind of forming secretly to rise up, and David was a part of that on the faculty side. They had heard about the denial, and he began organizing faculty, and I'll let him speak to that. Students were building alliances with other students of color and other interested groups, not only on the University of Michigan campus, but Michigan State University and Eastern Michigan University were supporting. And we addressed the Board of Regents. Tribal representatives gathered in front of the Board of Regents building. Students, our allies, University of Michigan faculty, staff. We issued a press statement, and in the press statement, we demanded the return of our ancestors and their belongings. And we told the truth about the non-compliance that the University of Michigan had been acting for many years, the way they had been acting. Before we went into the Regents building, we all prayed, and an elder sang a song. And in those collective prayers, we asked that at least one regent listen. And that's what we had hoped happened. And from that day forward, the University of Michigan made an institutional shift, and they are now one of the leaders in consultation and NAGPRA compliance throughout the United States. So I'm going to turn it to David and let him tell his story.
Miigwech, Shannon and SONYA. And in my culture, when one speaks of such things, respect is also shown by speaking bareheaded. This university was founded in 1817 by the treaty at the foot of the rapids. For over 2 centuries, the lack of respect and the fulfillment of commitments has continued. We have to move forward and to do better. And who can do this but the peoples with whom the treaties were signed, for whom this is homeland? I'm a curator at the Botanical Gardens. You would think that has nothing to do with repatriation or museums. Quite the contrary. Botanical gardens and research museums are beautiful, and we share the same foundational purposes as pharmacy gardens, as do all the other extractive museums of the Western Academy. In fact, the same person who founded the British Museum founded the first academic garden in England while he was a physician to 3 of the royal families in sequence. The purpose of university gardens is basically to colonize, to understand how plants are used, and to put that knowledge into a Western context. And so university gardens are deeply involved in the museum structure in most research universities, including this one. And that's where, as Shannon referred to, my roles as a faculty curator came in, because we were trying to begin to work with Anishinaabe nations of the state and getting nowhere with trying to understand the lands we steward. Not the lands we own, the lands that we steward that need to be co-managed and more. Lands that hold 1/3 of all the native plants and many of the threatened animals of this state. The kin, not accessions, not objects, the kin. I'm also on the museum studies faculty. It's a steering committee in the graduate school, and this is where many of the colleagues could be found. And part of the strategy here is to use agency where one has it, because the agency I have is as a curator in the gardens, not in the agency in an anthropology museum, but I'm a peer, so I can ask. And as I'd like to say a number of times, I'm not here to be an ally. I'm here to be an indicted co-conspirator, because we have to stand for integrity. We have to stand for respect and relationship, or we stand for nothing. Back to you, Shannon.
So in this work, I want to turn to Sonia and let her move to the next slide.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of summarize based on that story that Shannon told, some of the kind of proven strategies, what we found worked. And, you know, these are just points that Shannon had talked about. And if there are questions, we could go into them in the Q&A further, but just kind of pulling out some key points here. Number one, as mentioned, building coalitions. The importance of working, obviously, with Native folks on campus, but also in communities and local Native nations, building coalitions between students, faculty, and staff. There were visible protests that took place on the campus. You can see that depicted here in the slide. This is one of the pages from the NAGPRA comics, the first issue of the NAGPRA comic called Journeys to Complete the Work, that tells the story, this story about the University of Michigan's transformation. And what's shown here are some of those protests that happened outside of the student union, drumming, you know, full-time, 24/7, to just make the presence known during finals and exams weeks, and that's, students were involved, faculty and staff too, an important part of building coalitions. So I think what's changed now that we didn't see as much at that time, as Shannon said, I think when we were students, I didn't feel like students had power in the way that they do now. I think students, faculty, and staff have a different sort of power now in the age of social media. What I found is that institutions are terrified of showing up on social media, you know, in the era of Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And what we see is that this kind of social protest can have a difference. So building coalitions, visibly making protests, and be sure to involve students, faculty, and staff, because they do have power at institutions. I've seen from institutional leadership, they do want to listen. And in some ways are quite attuned to what's happening and try to make decisions that will head off. You know, they live in fear in some ways of oh my gosh, is this going to blow up on social media for us and look bad for us as an institution? That's power that we can have to make these institutions move. Number 3, direct appeals to university leadership. As Shannon had talked about, going to the regents, getting on the calendar, 5 minutes, you know, hoping that one regent is going to hear what's being said. That relates to number 4, which is moving the decision-making out of anthropology departments. What we saw at the University of Michigan is in fact a pattern nationally. Decision-making authority over ancestral remains is almost always in the hands of anthropology departments. Of course, we see that as hugely problematic because this is the fox guarding the hen house. I mean, these folks in anthropology departments want to maintain their collections and they make their decisions based on that. They aren't some kind of, you know, impartial decision makers, yet they're the ones who have been given authority to make decisions over repatriation and over cultural affiliation decisions as well.
And sometimes it's one person. It's one person at the institution who is given that responsibility. And oftentimes they don't have to report their progress. They don't have to report their consultations. And they can just sit silently and quietly until tribes really start knocking the doors down.
Absolutely the case that I found in so many institutions that I talk with and work with, that it's often one person who's making a decision and many people don't even know. Certainly leadership of these institutions don't even know that those decisions are being made. What we find is that they know very little about their legal responsibilities. So the more that you can do to move decision-making out of anthropology into, for example, campus legal compliance, or bring this to the attention of the leadership of an institution, you know, which may be writing directly to the chancellor, writing to the provost, writing to the person who's the vice chancellor for research and engagement, at least at UMass, that person would certainly sit up and pay attention. So making sure that decision-making authority isn't just one person, it's out of anthropology, and create a campus-wide, push for a campus-wide committee that makes these decisions. We've just now started, in fact, we had our first meeting here at UMass of our UMass Repatriation Oversight and Advisory Committee. So, and making sure that Native nations are represented on that committee as well. And not just one person, multiple people if possible, because what I see is that, you know, one person can try to be sidelined or quieted, but making sure you're not the only one Native person from a community.
And a multidisciplinary committee at the university, push for that so that there are deans and directors from other disciplines. It's just not anthropology and archaeology. And just want to acknowledge the Michigan Anishinaabe Culture Preservation Repatriation Alliance pressed the university to have at least one seat open for a tribal representative. And Willie Johnson has held that seat and has been representing our tribes since 2010 or 11, I believe.
And at UMass, our committee has a representative from, for example, environmental health and safety, because we know that some of these ancestral remains have been treated with chemicals, and, you know, we have to have them aware of what's happening before we can even think about returning remains to communities. And so someone who's aware of these kinds of issues, that there were toxic chemicals in some cases used on remains. We have someone from, again, as Shannon said, interdisciplinary group. We have someone who works in the history of science, who thinks about science ethics and knows nothing, doesn't engage on repatriation, but understands immediately that science shouldn't be done this way, who understands the connection of eugenics for how these ancestral remains have been studied and analyzed, and is then able to speak powerfully to the broader issues. So that kind of campus-wide committee can have a really huge impact. Number 6, building relationality into policies, what we're just calling here is indigenizing. You know, really trying to bring indigenous ways of knowing, thinking, and addressing issues into how the policies are formed, into the simple basic practices. As Shannon said, certainly relationality was not at the center when we had a 1-hour meeting at the university, right? Things like hosting, how you engage with people, being able to just think about building relationships, and that's the foundation of the work you're doing. There's so many ways we could think and talk about what it means to indigenize these policies and practices, but really at the foundation is the point of relationality, and trying to teach these institutions how to engage as a relative and thinking that way.
University of Michigan under Amadeus Scott and Dr. Ben Segunda work with tribal communities to develop a pre-transfer consultation meeting. And in the pre-transfer, we go through a document that is indigenized. You know, the document was designed to make sure that tribes put into place and could practice what they needed to do spiritually and culturally at the site for the ancestors. So this forum, I'm sure Dr. Segunda and Amadeus would share some of the tenets of that forum with you.
And then number 7, really useful and helpful to connect to the university's strategic plan and constantly make comparison to peer institutions. I say this as someone who's worked with many different institutions, and what I hear in these meetings with university leadership is everything they do is talk about, well, how does that fit our strategic plan? How does that work with our mission and our strategic plan? So whenever I want to accomplish something, I always go back to that strategic plan and to the mission, and I pull verbiage directly out. And that's the way to have them, of course, indigenize that and have it meet our kind of standards and ways of thinking and knowing. But that is what they're constantly talking about. They're also constantly making comparisons to peer institutions. What are our peer institutions doing? So now at UMass, I can say, they love to think University of Michigan as their peer institution. So University of Michigan and UC Berkeley, our peer institutions, have done X, Y, and Z. This is what we should do if we want to, you know, keep up with them. So those are some of the key ways, kind of strategies that come out. I'm sure there are many others we could think of, but these are some of the kind of 7 key strategies for addressing reluctant institutions. And Shannon and David, if you want to add anything else before we move on to the next step, happy to have that.
Yeah, so the next slide, Sonia, is the way forward. It's a way forward from dealing with a retentive and difficult university and institution to one where we are, in essence, opening more boxes and shelves. And this way forward began through consultation to bring home our ancestors. And I have to acknowledge my mother, Sydney Martin, who was a NAGPRA officer for the Gun Lake Pottawatomi, the Match-E-Be-Nash-She-Wish band, and Mr. Kevin Finney, who were serving as the representatives from our tribe during a very important consultation with the University of Michigan. And after we had finished talking about the ancestors and bringing them home and developing the timeline, we were sitting around just discussing other things, current events. And all of a sudden, Kevin and my mom, both of them asked, do you have seeds within the university collections? Heirloom seeds from our communities. And Amadeus Scott and Ben Segunda and Dr. Lisa Young, who was also part of these discussions, said, I think we do. We'll look into it. And within 3 weeks, they sent us an inventory of some of the holdings within the ethnographic collections at the University of Michigan. And so that began the idea. And I want to acknowledge all the folks yesterday who were talking about changing the language. And we as Indigenous peoples, we can start changing the language. We don't have to speak in the way of that voice that has dictated to us who we are, where we came from, where we're going. Let's use our own voice and our own language. So I want to have us think about that moving forward. And when we think about rematriation, somebody in the text panels yesterday said, repatriation, let's use rematriation. And rematriation is a part of this project, this Heritage Seeds project that we're working on now. And when we think about rematriation, it's the act of reclamation and returning our ancestors' belongings, knowledge, and seeds back to their original natural and spiritual context. And that is the work that we're doing moving forward, because from NAGPRA, we can open more boxes with these institutions that were forbidden to us before. I'm going to let David speak about this project.
Botanical gardens usually don't hold seeds, and museums of anthropology don't have any capacity to grow them. This is part of the Western construct of how knowledge is structured and what institution holds what. And so, although these are botanical collections, the gardens had no knowledge of them. And the museum, having no ethnobotanist on the faculty at present, was not active with it. And so had Elder Sidney Martin here in the center not asked, I don't think anybody would have put the pieces together. And this is part of indigenizing the museum collections in the university, of seeing the whole for the shattering that it has gone through to fit the Western academic mindset, one in which I'm 30 years curator here and deeply entrenched in not defending it, but going, oh, so how do we knit back?
American Indian Museum.
I think I just lost our place. But I'll find it real quick, because I wanted to ask a question, because I just wanted to put an exclamation on that point that you made, David. Nobody was even thinking about the seeds until Mama Sydney asked. Like no one. It's incredible to me that institutions don't even know what they have in their collections, right?
You got it. And we oftentimes don't even know to ask. And to acknowledge Dr. Lisa Young, who Shannon Martin has mentioned already, she'd talked to me over the years about her work with some of the Hopi Nation and seeds. And I hadn't put it together that there's this huge seed collection that's tribal, even though at one point earlier I'd seen part of it. You know, so my own mind was fragmented. But Shannon, our host, this is all part of indigenizing of how we think and the benefits to everybody, most of all, the peoples and their seeds in this particular case. Miigwech, thanks.
Yes. Shannon, anything you want to add at this point?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge all the individuals you see in this picture you have up. This was the first kind of think tank, dreaming and scheming group that was pulled together at the Matthaei Botanical Gardens to address, that question: do you have seeds, and how can we free them? Part of this group included Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, her sister, Dr. Barbara Wall. I'm seeing SONYA ATALAY was there, and tribal representatives from Little Traverse Band, Pokagon Band, Saginaw Chippewa. So it was an amazing gathering where we were able to spend time and to dream of the possibilities of how we could get this done, knowing that seeds were a hard ancestral relative to free from an institution under NAGPRA. So how do we circumvent NAGPRA, but still use, its language and the law and the spirit of the law, but how can we do this work together? And we could do this work together because we had friends we made, colleagues we made through the University of Michigan who were situated in positions that could help facilitate this for the tribes. And that includes, David and Lisa Young, Ben and Amadeus were on board. The Committee for Culturally Identifiable Human Remains, they were all actively involved in this project. So, David, you had a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. This really points out part of the strategy that was just gone through. On the university side, there are only 5 people in that picture from the gardens, but I see a then retired vice president, I believe, of the university, the interim director and dean of one of the colleges, the NAGPRA office staff, including Dr. Ben Secunda, who had been extremely helpful in going through the internal politics of how to assemble an interdisciplinary team. There are 4 or 5 tribal faculty professors from peer institutions. This idea of what are our peers doing? We don't have to ask what our peers are doing. Our peers can speak for themselves right here in the meeting. And so it was this assemble a team that can't be ignored.
Oof, yes. I want to raise one question that was brought in our chat by Lance. I think it's a good question. It says, would it be easier to ask neighboring tribes for their seeds? Some are still growing traditional seeds. I think I might know what the answer is, but would you all like to address that?
Do you want to go first, Shannon, or would you rather I?
Go ahead, David.
Why not do both? It's not an either or. Furthermore, the seeds that are in the museum are not necessarily going to be able to be germinated forever. And so in a subsequent meeting where we also have representatives from Intertribal Agricultural Council, Dan Cornelius out of Madison, Wisconsin, we had the lead seed corn officer from USDA in the seed bank in Fort Collins, Colorado. Wow. There's a lot of discussion about what to do, but one of the things about what's in the museums is they predate any contamination by GMO pollen coming in from contemporary neighboring farmers. And that may be a really important issue. And there may be seeds that are in the museums that even the neighboring tribes don't have, just as what the neighboring tribes have may not be in the museum at all. So do them all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I, Lance's question was kind of asked, like, wouldn't it just be easier to go to other tribes? But I think that the question is just like our ancestors and other cultural objects that are in institutions, is that these have a connection. They are part of those tribes that they're connected to, right? Shannon, I think I heard you mention something like that earlier on.
Yeah, when we first, I think our second visit to the ethnographic collections of the seeds, we were allowed into the collection storage facility, and we were pulling open some shelves, and we pulled open a shelf that said Allegan County, and my mom and my dad and I were standing there, and you could feel the sense of belonging and the pull and the energy when we opened that cabinet drawer up, because of the connection. It was like the spirit of those seeds, even though they were encased in plastic and tissue paper. When they were brought out, we were allowed to hold, you know, some cobs from that collection that came directly from a farm that my mom and grandmother grew up near, and where they would get their corn. And it was a family who survived, you know, the Pottawatomi Trail of Tears. They stayed right in Allegan County, hid out in the forest, and then found their own piece of land and began to farm that. And we held those cobs of corn that are no longer growing in our county anymore. And I don't believe my mom asked around to our tribe. She talked to some folks, and we don't believe that corn, that variety is the seeds are still within that family. So that's why it's so important for us when we visit these types of institutions to do NAGPRA work and to build relationships with the curators and the museums within the institutions, to ask those questions, find out what they have. And it's not just seeds, but what the curators brought out for us were field notebooks and guides that were handwritten by spiritual medicine people and herbalists that were donated to the, somehow got into or donated to the museum, to the collections. So there are other spiritual, cultural, intellectual, and medicinal forms of knowledge that is being kept in the institutions. And if we don't ask the questions, we're never going to know. So ask the questions. We have to use our voices, because we may find something that can be reclaimed and reactivated within our communities to make us whole again.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Lance mentions there's even a ceremony to pass on seeds where he comes from.
Yes, there's ceremony and protocols here as well, Lance. And some of those protocols and songs and ceremonies are being reactivated because of these projects and intertribal relationships that are happening now. And it's a beautiful thing. Like, these ancestors are speaking to us. They're revealing important protocols, information, songs, and prayers. They're not just giving us food life, but they're giving us spiritual life too. And that they're helping to restore and bring things back for us. So miigwech for saying that about ceremony, because those types of things are being reactivated because of this beautiful work that's happening.
Excellent. All right, so let's get back to our video. Here we go.
In this, and I thank Shannon, SONYA, the elders, William Johnson, and Ben Secunda and Amadeus has been to change my thinking and to realize that everything is about kinships, and kinships are relationships, and relationships mean guidance, and guidance from those who know more. And so that means you, me, Dr. Curator, need to learn humility and how to listen. That is a very different position from the whole training I've had as a faculty curator, a postdoc elsewhere, that there are accessions and that this implies ownership. And ownership is ultimately about dominion, and that itself is arrogance. So somewhere in this learning to listen comes the transition to hear what bulleted: relationships must be honored and restored. And SONYA was talking about the documentation, and that takes us right back to the foundational paperwork that documents the treaty at the foot of the rapids that established this university in 1817, in large part with a land transfer from the tribes to what is the university. We could have the next image. 30 years here, well, 25 at the time Sydney asked, and I had no clue that this building on the left held this aisle of seeds. I believe Dr. Young has told me over 4,000 different seed lots from indigenous communities of Turtle Island, complete with all their data, the metadata, whose garden, what the plant is, what it was called, who harvested it. Oh my goodness. These are the living kin of people still here. And you and I know that many of the seeds are alive. How to deal with this? With an institution, the Anthropology Museum, which is underfunded in its own eyes, and understandably from that perspective. So we found the resources, a $10,000 planning grant, ultimately based on sustainability, about can we assemble experts from around Anishinaabe realm, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and practitioners about how to think the way forward for the seeds to come to their destiny, as Shannon put it, to be married with the earth, at least some of them. There are many people to thank. One in the middle taking photographs, Dan Cornelius Oneida from Intertribal Agriculture is one. But the idea is, can we get seeds out of this museum and into the earth, as you see here, in a courtyard at the Botanical Gardens? It's in where it will be under elder guidance, a matriarchy, and cared for in the ways it needs to be. Several key elements come into this. One is, as curator, not trying to control it, but trying to be a facilitator to what others are saying must happen. Another one is to document it so that it can stand up to the scrutiny of the academy, so that we have a pilot case of how do you rematriate seeds. This is probably the third largest tribal seed collection in North America, rivaled, to my knowledge, only by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Smithsonian, jointly held in the Department of Agriculture of Canada. Most are not Anishinaabe, but let's start with the Anishinaabe. We have the next image, Sonia. I think pictures speak better than I do. So one of the issues has been, are the seeds even alive? Because we asked the head conservator from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to be present as part of this, and she was. And the comment was that the seeds were not alive, that corn doesn't live this long, and many things that just made no sense at all to me, let alone to tribal elders and seed keepers who know that traditionally seeds were not kept in sub-zero temperatures with liquid nitrogen and air conditioning and all the rest of the climate control. That just doesn't sound like a traditional way of keeping seeds. And so one of the issues has been, are the seeds viable? How will we do it? So what we've been doing the last 3 years in this courtyard is growing seeds from other nations in the region, some Anishinaabe, some not. I believe this is this is a Meskwaki corn here that was just planted and harvested, to show, one, we can grow them, and second, Dan Cornelius, he's also has USDA roles, was able to get a more than 20-year-old seed out of the seed archive through the USDA, supposedly one that wouldn't grow. We marked every single seed going in the ground. It not only germinated just as well as the modern, the contemporary tribal corn, but it produced just as well. So much for the idea that it's not alive. This is, quote, research that's community-centered, and importantly, it fits the criteria of research as understood by the university museum system, so that we can ask now for seeds from the nations, the nations of Michigan that are in the museum, to germinate them, because over 3 years we've shown we can grow them together. We've shown we can harvest them together. Everything is done under ceremony. Planting is all with traditional tools. And all the seeds are rematriated to communities. None are kept here at the University Botanical Gardens. It's involved, as Shannon and Sonya have mentioned, networking. This is Shiloh Maples, our regional Indigenous Seed Keepers Network contact for the Great Lakes, with one of the squash that was just harvested about 10 days ago. We call this the baby picture for obvious reasons. But to see life and to see things coming back is in itself miraculous and humbling. So to go forward, this means we have to come to various agreements that I believe we are close to doing. But it's about relationships, it's about trust, and it's about facilitating. One strange element is that we're inside a courtyard that is open to the sky with glass greenhouses and brick walls on all sides. This keeps the raccoons out, the deer out, and importantly, researchers who might want leaf tissues to do whatever they choose to do without telling us, they have to come through our secured areas. And yes, there have been requests to, can they just come, people not from our university, just come and do, say, paper punches. And I know enough about genomic works to know that gives you enough to extract the whole genome. So the answer is no, for these are not our seeds, these are not our kin, and permission will have to be asked of those of whom they are relatives. These are stewarded here. They are visiting kin, and I cannot give you permission to do anything.
So David, did you have a question or or comment?
I had a comment that I wanted to make. Since this was recorded, the agreement has been reached, and it is between the regents of the university and the Michigan Anishinaabe Cultural and Repatriation Alliance. A key element of it, or there's several key elements, but among them are that the seeds do not belong to the university. That is declared. And that the intellectual property rights of the seeds belong to the peoples. That is, the peoples of origin. That is, unlike other universities, we're not claiming we own the patent rights, even if the seeds are rematriated. It's acknowledged right up front that we don't turn them over because that implies we have them. We acknowledge the university, the regents of the university in this signed agreement acknowledge that the intangible rights belong to the people of origin.
Wow.
That's a key issue.
Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible to get. I mean, to me, that's just as miraculous to get an institution to do that. And I mean, that's a real commitment. And an indigenization, decolonization of that institution. How amazing. Shall we continue, or Shannon, you want to mention anything?
Well, I just want to acknowledge the hard work of all of the 12 federally recognized and 2 state historic tribes in Michigan. They worked long and hard on with David and with the Michigan Anishinaabe Cultural Preservation Repatriation Alliance attorney, Angela Sherrigan, with the University of Michigan General Counsel. So it was a long process, but the end result is something that we truly believe could be a template for other tribes and institutions. That memorandum of agreement and moving forward with the potential to free the seeds so that our people can rematriate them and get them back into our communities. And all along the process, what we had to contend with, and much like we have to when we try to repatriate our ancestors, is the notion of loss of knowledge, loss of material, and institutions and federal repositories like to relegate and label these types of materials that way and pose them as possessions that are going to be lost forever. But through the discussions, the Anishinaabe people continue to impress upon university officials and legal counsel that these seeds are alive. They have a spirit. They're alive, and they're not going to be destroyed, because we hear that terminology, destructive analysis, when we deal with NAGPRA.
Mm-hmm.
These seeds are going to, it's creation. It's about creative analysis. It's not destructive analysis. It's our people and the university allowing them to do their work and to live and to feed and to sustain once again. So again, sustainability and creation, we had to keep using that type of terminology with them to help them to understand that these aren't just a collection item. These are living beings that are being held in plastic and in shelves.
Right. Absolutely. And have no place. They were never created to sit in a shelf. The creator doesn't work that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's return.
So with that, perhaps looking at here about honoring and restoring relationships, we're focused on getting seeds back to the communities that knew them and in the language and ceremonies that will welcome them. That is not mine to determine, that is mine to figure out how to host. And that includes finding the budgets to do it. That is honorable. It means we have to listen to the elders rather than telling the elders what the scientific protocols are, because that's basically irrelevant. What's relevant is indigenous ways of knowing, kinomagi, and how can we find the bridges forward. Everything has to be elder guided, including what is and is not kept and what information is and is not shared. I, last week, again, turned down a media request about this project and the harvest, because only once we all agree what will be said, will there be any media about it, and it will be concurrent with the tribal communities. And so I also listened to other botanic gardens. I'm active nationally in them in university contexts about who's doing what. Where are the stumbling blocks? Right now, I would say it is in between the ears of most of my fellow curators and garden staff for thinking of accessions and domination and arrogance, not intentionally, but it's just they're so marinated in it, they can't see it. But the change is to how do we show respect for life, for people, for Mother Earth. Sonia and Shannon, if you would like to continue.
I was just going to add, thank you so much, David, for sharing this and talking about these key points. And I just wanted to add too that thinking about the NAGPRA comics and trying to get ideas and knowledge about NAGPRA out there, a little plug for that. This is going to be, this story about rematriating seeds is going to be the NAGPRA comic number 3. So we've been a little bit held up by COVID. NAGPRA comic number 2 was supposed to come out this fall, and we're just waiting for final approval on that. We're working on that with the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. But number 3, NAGPRA comic number 3 will tell this story about opening the doors. How often we hear that NAGPRA, the fear was repatriation is going to shut the door to all. In fact, this story shows that it's the opposite. It shuts the door to the way research used to be done, an extractive kind of research model, but this opens the door and, opens the shelves and boxes to a regenerative, relationality-based form of research.
If I could add one element, and also this opens to the doors to the relationships that let us return to the question of the thousands of acres of lands that the university stewards that are, quote, research tracks but on which it's well documented most of them have very little research in living memory. Why aren't these co-managed, and whatever doorway co-management leads to, with the peoples and the cultures who know the lands?
Shannon, do you want anything more before we move on to the next, or should I advance?
You can advance, but during this advancement, I just want to acknowledge some of the protectors and liberators of seeds even prior to this University of Michigan and MACPRA project. In one of our gatherings, we were able to engage with Robin Wall Kimmerer and her sister Barbara Wall, and as well as Rowan White and Dr. Elizabeth Hoover, who are all on the front lines with liberating and protecting seeds, teaching us how to engage with them, how to move forward in this process. You know, and I would look them up to read more about the work that they're each doing in their respective fields and the return to the earth. So as we think about, you know, this movement for land back, I was so inspired by Auntie Suzanne last night, who talked about ancestors back. You know, in the early discussions of architecting the NACPRA law, we want them back was the battle cry. They need to come home. So ancestors back. And if we think in those terms, ancestors, seeds are our ancestors. Coalition building with these seed protectors, indigenous seed protectors, is going to help us move forward to liberate these seeds and rematriate them from the various institutions where they're held. And when you open more shelves and look into more boxes during your NACPRA consultation work for the ancestors, you're also going to find notebooks that may include traditional indigenous knowledge on medicines, on teas. We have found some of that within the University of Michigan ethnographic collections. And those may be a link back to your grandpa or your great grandma, where an anthropologist took field notes and walked the earth with them, and they shared this important knowledge. So rematriation of knowledge, bringing those types of spiritual and medicinal practices back home to your community. So encourage you, when you do these consultations at various institutions and repositories, there are other spirits calling for you. Other ancestors are there waiting for you to bring them home as well. And that brings about great healing. And the healing begins and continues, and that's work that flows through the work we do here in Michigan as we listen to our ancestors who continue to guide us. They reveal information, they reveal protocols that will help us move forward. And their lessons will support all of our future work. When we put our faith and trust into the thousands of generations of ancestors who came before us, and we reclaim and we reactivate all of their intentions and what they'd hoped for us, that's the strength and power for all of us who have been called and chosen to take on this responsibility of repatriation and rematriation. That will help move us forward. And this healing is needed for our communities, especially during this time. And I want to encourage all of you that this beautiful responsibility to effectuate NACPRA on behalf of your tribal nation or on behalf of your institution or repository, we can still engage in this work and have meaningful consultations virtually. So I want to encourage you all to not stop. We need to keep keep this movement going. And as we look at the future of NAGPRA, my sister SONYA states it beautifully, and I want to turn it back to her as NAGPRA as a teacher.
Yeah, thank you both. Just really to close up and think about the future of NAGPRA, really what I've seen, and I think we've on this panel and maybe many of you as well, what I've experienced is that repatriation is a teacher. It's like pedagogy for these institutions that need to learn. Oftentimes when we see research happening in partnership with Native nations, you know, community-based participatory research, we hear talk about capacity building, that, you know, the research is going to build capacity for communities who, you know, and I just always think it's not just communities that need and can benefit from capacity building, right? Institutions need to learn, and repatriation is a beautiful and powerful teacher for how to build meaningful relationships and bring relationality back to the center, our indigenous ways of knowing and engaging. We have indigenous science, we have our own knowledge systems, and the ways that repatriation teaches us how to braid those together with the Western ways of knowing and doing things. And it facilitates healing, particularly in this time as we are in a world in crisis. And what we need are these indigenous ways of knowing and indigenizing these institutions as part of this larger project of decolonization. You know, healing and restoration of indigenous land and life. And always remembering that that's at the center, that's at the heart of what we're doing. So as we look to the future in the next decades of NAGPRA, I think we see repatriation as our teacher. Miigwech, Michener.
So I think at this time, Anne or Shannon, we could maybe have some discussions and field some questions.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. And thank you all. I know if we were all together, we'd be having a good round of applause right now. Thank you for your presentation. We do have some questions in the Q&A that I can ask. This first one is from Ray Gould. What are some suggestions for how to balance the additional labor required of people at institutions, for example, on the campus-wide committee at UMass? How can people get institutions to recognize this labor in terms of service to the university institution as part of their regular responsibilities, rather than as additional work put on people?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. Thank you for the question, Ray. I think this is part of kind of trying to braid our indigenous ways of knowing into these spaces and institutions, because what especially Research 1, R1 kind of institutions tend to think is that it's the research, and we say service, but that's a very much smaller kind of piece. It doesn't count, right? So we need to transform institutions in ways that actually count this and see this not as service in itself, but as a valuable part. It's part of the research process. And David mentioned this too, this piece about deep listening. You know, deep listening doesn't just happen, and it doesn't just not happen. It happens because you're in an environment where that's valued. You're in an environment where that's taught. And so I think a lot of this starts in the classrooms and the kind of training we give to our students, you know, training students to think about and practice deep listening, training them to engage in relationships, training them that piece about relationality isn't somehow service or extra, but it is fundamental and central. And I think we have to get the leadership of institutions to understand this. And yeah, the piece about it ends up being additional labor, more committees constantly being asked to be on these committees. I don't have any better strategies other than trying to explain these pieces. David.
Great question. And the thing I would say is that my experience, 30 years here, 20 years with various aspects of learning about decolonizing or indigenizing, because indigenizing puts the indigenous nations first, as opposed to decolonizing the museum. Let's make that derivative. Yes, it is going to require extra work that's uncompensated, and having your supervisor tell you that you're doing something that's not important, which I got multiple times until diversity, equity, and inclusion came in, and this became the central part of the department's plan. Amazing. The work didn't change, the context did. For many, this will not be met with great pleasure by the current power structure. That's where humility and courage are essential. Why are we called to have these jobs? To live secure middle-class jobs if you're of the majority culture, or are we here to witness something with our lives that makes meaning for the generations ahead? And that's the question I put back. And it's one of, I think Shannon put it, the seeds the ancestors are calling. Will you rise to it? And it will require work. And I say that not as a punishment, but as the system only responds to certain kinds of pressure. And each university will have different pressure points. Find your allies, understand the system, and believe in the power of what is happening.
I'd like to echo David in that the tribes provide a circle of inclusion for the university to learn from us, to participate with us as we're doing this sacred work. And with the seeds, we empower the university officials and students and continue to tell them that these are living beings, they're spirits. And we have to treat them with reverence and an understanding that they are waiting to give back to the people. And one of the oral arguments that the tribes have come forward with, because you have to sort of play on their field, when it comes to science, the tribes have said, you have conducted science without our consultation on our ancestors by mining their DNA. That is destructive analysis. And what we are presenting as tribes is to work with us on reconstructive analysis. Let us liberate, rematriate these seeds, and we can work together to grow them out and to get them back into the communities and back into the families for well-being and strength and healing. And we can do this together. So that is one of our arguments. And through that doing together, we're teaching, we're sharing, we're strategizing, we're creating a little bit of policy through legal MOUs to protect intellectual property, but that's all part of this concentric circle that we are building around these sacred seeds. And it's the same with our sacred ancestors. And looking forward to the confidentiality panel later on this afternoon with what we share and what we don't share and what's being taken without our permission. So I want to just say that much.
Thank you. Let's see, we have a lot of questions. I don't know that we won't be able to get to them all, so I apologize for that. But this is from Caitlin Trammell. Is there a published paper or any other published information about the Botanical Garden project that could be shared with permission?
There are a few elements. I can find some of them and send links in because I don't keep them in my head so they can be found that way. But one of the key points is that whatever is said has to be agreed by all parties involved. The kinship circle has to agree. And this creates a lot of frustration for university administrators and publicists who want to show, quote, the good work. But I just come back with this, we're not trying to hide it, but universities have a long tradition, a long history of self-promotion. And for integrity, maybe some modesty is involved, and letting others voice, that is others, letting partners, those in the circle of kinship, express what needs to be expressed, and us helping then disperse the word. And that's why the pace is going at the pace of elder guidance rather than of the publicists or the research journals. So I'll share links.
I'd like to also acknowledge the Field Museum in Chicago, and they've been working with rematriating seeds back to their descendant communities. And I think just this past summer, that first transfer took place to the Meskwaki, and that was supported by their advisory council at the field, who it's made up of Indigenous folks.
Just a quick add-on there. I believe it was 3 years ago, Elder Sidney Martin and I co-presented at the Field Museum in a conference on Indigenous ways with plants. And I found it mortifying that most of the presentations were given by majority culture persons without the co-presenter or the lead presenter from the culture and nation that knows the plants as kin. And to those of you who are out there who are like me of the majority culture, just shut up.
I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from Kristen Landau. She said, I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts on reluctant institutions in the time of budget reductions in COVID. She gives the example of her institution terminating the anthropology department, yet they have a sizable collection.
I can speak a little bit to that, which is to say, one of the things I've always said is what would make NAGPRA and repatriation of our ancestors happen within a year, let's say, is if federal funds for these institutions were held until these institutions were in compliance. If that were to happen, these institutions would be on it. Our ancestors would be going home quickly. So, you know, money obviously is an important point. And during COVID, I mean, I know budgets are being cut, budgetary times are tight. What we've seen at UMass, thankfully, is that we've been able to maintain funds to work on this. And in fact, we've found ways to bring in students to assist through classes. We have our NAGPRA coordinator, Julie Woods, who's teaching a wonderful course called Decolonizing Collections, and, you know, bringing students in as a way to train students, but also have them assist with the work and give credits. This shouldn't all be done by students, right? But it's a start. And it also means that we have to push these institutions to think about legal compliance. Go to the legal compliance officers, go to the lawyers for the institutions. Are they aware of their legal responsibilities and how this leaves them very open to potential problems? And you might find ways that money begins to be redirected towards NAGPRA work.
Thank you, Sonia.
One of the other components following up on Sonia and the money issue, there was a strategy when we were battling with the University of Michigan, the Alumni Association. We had folks within the Alumni Association who began to reach out to other alumni, and they started withholding their annual donations to the university. So there's, you know, a multi-pronged approach that you can take with that, as well as the holdings. We researched the university's investment portfolio and started to reach out to some of the corporations who work with the university and provided them private and corporate funding.
My element I would add, and it echoes Sonia and Shannon, is it's not about money, it's about priorities. It's about integrity, ethics, and morality. And money here is just being used as an excuse to not step up, to not make decisions, or rather to make decisions that are often self-serving.
Woo! All right. Damn, David, you are a. Thank you for being such a powerful ally on this issue. Your leadership and your words are so strong, and we need more individuals like you and institutions to help us pull things together. This has been great. Let me be quiet. I'm just, it was so powerful to be able to watch this again, and just reconsidering everything with where we are, 6 months later. So what do you have to update? Is there anything that you all want to update from that?
David, go ahead with the recent plantings in the continuum of the Heritage Garden.
Sure. So last Saturday, June 26th, we had the second planting of the Indigenous Collaborative Garden, as the site is now called. And it is a Turtle Mountain Mandamin corn, the seed brought by Dan Cornelius, Oneida of Intertribal Agriculture in Wisconsin. And he got here at 3 a.m. There was a good party present. By party, I mean people, including 3 generations of the Frankenberger family Quay from Grand Traverse Bend. Elder Deb Frankenberger, Tina Frankenberger, and then her maybe 3-year-old Alice. And it was good to have several children present at the planting. As of 2 days ago, they started to germinate. We've had some good rains, and about 70 to 80% are up as of this morning. We actually mark where every seed goes so that we can follow the germination rates. So this is really exciting in many ways. It's an unusual corn, unusual to me, clearly known to the Turtle Mountain, but it's this whole issue of diaspora of the Anishinaabe at Turtle Mountain may well have had this as part of their diaspora to that part of the edge of the prairies and the Canadian-U.S., what's now the Canadian-U.S. border. This will be rematriated. I want to emphasize the seeds do not remain here at the university. 100% of them go back at the Harvest Feast. And the planting and the Harvest Feast are fully hosted by the university. This is part of being honorable. So it's exciting to see the germination, to see it going. It's a short season corn, so we're expecting the harvest in October, given that we're in southern Michigan and it's a northern climate corn. So those were some of the key issues just about the planting. I had a couple other things, but Shannon Martin, maybe it would be best if you went next or first after.
I'd like to acknowledge the future workshopping of NAGPRA Comics 3. So David and my mother, Sydney, my dad, George, sister Pumpkin, Kevin, probably Summer Garcia from the Bequejanong First Nation, Dan Cornelius, as well as other university officials like Lisa Young, Carlos Sinopoli, Amadeus Scott, and Ben Segunda. We're all going to virtually workshop the story for NAGPRA Comics number 3 about the Seeds Project. And also the co-curated Black Ash Basket exhibition that was completed between the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan and the University of Michigan. So those 2 stories are going to be featured in NAGPRA Comics 3. So we're excited to get together here at the end of this month for a couple of workshopping sessions with Dr. SONYA ATALAY, Dr. Jen Shannon, and Dr. John Swager, the three amigos who are behind NAGPRA Comics and who are working with tribes to help us get our stories out so that it can inspire others.
The instigators, yes.
Co-conspirators
Co-conspirators.
is David's. Co-conspirators, liberators, dreamers and schemers, all those good things.
So in the comments, Sarah Bashinger, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, mentioned that Robin Kimmerer and Rowan White are amazing, and they are.
Mm-hmm.
And through our Quay here, the powerful women involved, both have been here, some more than once, and we try to keep people appraised of what's going on. Yes, they're absolutely amazing, and they're part of the guidance and part of the awareness that majority culture curators need to learn humility. Jean Beaubien raises a number of really good points about the protocols. Remind him of the treaty process of the friendship belts among the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. And you've nailed it, because tribes are sovereign. The university regents are the ones who make agreements with other countries, basically. And that's one of the things that I keep emphasizing with my colleagues here at the U of M. Curators, faculty, research staff, scientists are so used to having our own autonomy out of our own privileged positions that we think it's ours to go and do things. Well, some of this needs to be treaty-based. That may be the form of a MOU or a memo of understanding through the Office of Counsel General, but the anthropology and the botany units cannot sign protocols of intellectual property recognition. That belongs to the state, and arrogant as we are not the state. Let's get back to where we belong, which is showing some respect about learning how to live together on this earth for the benefit of the generations ahead. And that has come through working with really great elders, and I say great in terms of that they're willing, they have the patience to deal with people like myself. What an ordeal. And they have the patience to deal with my peers, many of whom are very supportive, including many of the current staff and directors and faculty and leadership of the museums. But I can't imagine what it's like from the other side. What I can do is try to help find the way.
And that you did, David. Shannon, did you want to? I'm blown away with this work and the promise that it shows, and what started as a contentious relationship with the University of Michigan, not doing anything to repatriate what was required under the law, became this humbling and miraculous, I'll use your words, David, enterprise where they are giving everything back, or they're beginning to give that back, which was never theirs to begin with, and acknowledging that it's not theirs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the University of Michigan it really is it's a love story now, but it was very contentious. It was hurtful when we first began discussions regarding our ancestors. But we're at a point now where we can continue to ask the questions. We can continue to transform the institution and indigenize it. And there are many who are open to this happening. And it's just not at the University of Michigan, but when institutions like it do this type of wonderful work and can change and can shift, others take notice and they see the benefits of what the relationships and what the work is accomplishing. But that's not to say that folks like David and others who are working in their positions aren't taking the hits or getting criticized, because I know they are. Because it really is still astounds me about the cutthroat world of academia. And I worked for the University of Michigan for a number of years, but it still astounds me in this day and age that classical Western mentality of anthropologists and archaeologists and ethnologists going out there to study our people with their notebook and recorders, that is considered hardcore research and in the academy. But there are still aspects and folks that are working in the institution who say that the work David is doing with Indigenous communities is not rigorous. It's not hardcore research. And they like to criticize that, saying, oh, that's just, David, he's just off working with his Indians again. And that nothing is, there are no results and nothing's being done. And I think it's a form of jealousy that there is a mutual, respectful relationship happening where we're working together to transform institutional protocol, research, and knowledge in their approach to working with Indigenous people. And we're getting amazing work done and getting great results. And it's for the betterment of our own communities. But still the university is gaining the knowledge and the instruction that they're receiving, because we're opening some of our gardening protocols and opening the earth songs. We're sharing that with students so that they have and can identify their own Indigenous or cultural connection to the earth by working with us. So it's really, I'm still amazed by it, just the cutthroat world of the academy and the criticisms that David and others like him and other Indigenous scholars across this country are criticized for doing collaborative research with tribal or Indigenous communities. And their counterparts, some of them are saying it's not rigorous enough, or that's not deserving of a research article, or I'm going to stop your tenure because I don't think the work you've been doing is rigorous. It's just, and the work that the folks are doing with Indigenous communities nowadays, not just on repatriation or rematriation and seeds, but there's other amazing work going on out there with Indigenous communities, and scholars are doing the work and are being criticized for it. So we have to be advocates for them too, and to pump them up and pray for them and continue working with these folks at the institutions to help in this transformation. And not just with policies, protocols, but with the mindset of how research is viewed.
Absolutely. Oh, well, I hope everyone thoroughly enjoyed it. This has been a really powerful time. I think, David, you wanted to respond to JD, who's one of our YouTube viewers. And JD saying, please don't take this negatively. It is what has been the experience of others. My mom says when talking or negotiating with the being polite powers that be, always include what will benefit them and speak their language. All have any comments for that? David, did you want to say something in particular?
Well, I was wondering if JD wanted to express a bit more about that, because one, I see the point and agree that's part of the tactic strategy, but part of the benefit we had here in working with the seeds is MACPRA already existed, an alliance of all the Anishinaabe tribes of the state with the legal authority to sue the university in federal court, as I understand it. And so the negotiation was the discussion that Shannon talked about of the MOU was fundamentally between the Office of the Counsel General at the university and MACPRA. But to my knowledge, the two attorneys never met. Instead, what it was several of us were the discussion content intermediaries, but we would only ever talk about it at a MACPRA meeting on site, which being on tribal land is not FOIA-able. And the language had to be agreeable to the tribal council, who is also the chief justice now, or I'm wanting to get Angela's new title correct. I believe she Chief Justice of the Tribal Court here in Michigan, but there had to be an agreement, and this is what took literally years and multiple meetings of, yes, JD, I agree with this, but I think part of the reason this is working is the University Council realized, who had already been working with NAGPRA for all these years, that there was much she too needed, and the university needed to learn of what was the reality and how to express it. And by the way, that there's a time limit on this agreement, but it can be renewed. That way, if something unanticipated shows up, the tribes are not locked into the agreement. And that was at the request of tribal council.
Very good.
So I wondered if JD I said it's about capitalization for the colonizers. Yeah, and part of it is getting the colonizers to realize it's in their own self-interest to get out of this exploitive mindset.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that museums have been so enlightened once they've opened their doors to those conversations with tribes. I mean, they've never known what was really in their collections until they've had those conversations. And so it makes no sense why you would want to not have that discussion across the table with tribes. Well, we are getting close to the end of our time tonight. Anything else you all want to share about how to best move forward, or anything else besides the new NAGPRA comics that we're looking forward to seeing soon? Does that process how long does that process usually take when you get started on it?
Well, I think once we are able to come together for a few sessions of brainstorming and workshopping, according to SONYA, John is going to be sketching out the storyboards for the comic as we're meeting and talking, and then we'll work and edit to distill and to make it cohesive, and then John will colorize it, and after that, after we do all the editing, it'll go to print. So hopefully we should have NAGPRA Comics 3. I would like to see it unveiled at the Repatriation Conference.
Oh yeah. Excellent.
Maybe the last day. So I'll talk to SONYA about that, and Jen, Shannon, and John, and see if we can't be able to get it launched. Have it launched at the Repatriation Conference this November. That
would be incredible, and absolutely, you all can do that. We will make the space for that.
So an element with that is this coming year, not this year. The first set of seeds to be historic seeds to be rematriated out of the museum, rather than old seeds from USDA or from communities, but out of the museum itself. Ones that we're seeing during those meetings is intended to be next year. All the protocol has been agreed. The sign agreement has happened. What is at present an issue is when it's not planting season. This got agreed to fairly during the winter, but it's tribal protocols of the home community for bringing the seeds home, for singing to them in the museum, for the ceremonies, for the protocols, and how will this happen? And so, although the paperwork has now been done on all sides, the actual movement of the seeds, the transfer, the rematriation is totally under elder and ceremonial control, process, and timing.
Excellent. Beautiful. Well, I'm so appreciative of both of you joining us tonight to share and this video and update us on what's happened since. Hope we get to have this discussion again in the next few months and see what's going on. But until then, I'm going to say good night and close out the show. Thank you so much, Shannon and David.
Miigwech, Shannon, and Association on American Indian Affairs, Red Hoop Talk, for providing this amazing platform for Indian country to discuss our issues, our successes, our hopes and dreams and history and everything in between. So thank you for that.
And thank you. And just to respond to JD, I took no disrespect. I think I took it the way you intended. There has to be the courage to have a hard conversation, and power is afraid of reality.
Ooh.
Ooh.
Well, on that note, David, I should just let you close the show first. Well, I'm going to say good night to you both. Thank you very much. I'm going to close out the show, and we'll see you later.
Bamapi.
Bamapi.
Duwabman.
So, wow, what a show. I'm so glad you all were here to share it with us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. Let's see. I know there were things that I wanted to close out with. Oh, yes. Please, we'd love your support. We'd love you to go to YouTube after you're done watching the show and subscribe if you haven't already. What that subscription will do will help us build power and strength so that we could potentially monetize our YouTube channel. And if we monetize our YouTube channel, then we might have a couple of extra dollars to put towards Red Hoop Talk, or to put towards our repatriation work or Indian child welfare work, or to put more money into summer camps that we provide grants for during the year. So if you could help us that way, I'd really appreciate it. If you'd like to help us more, you can go to our website at indian-affairs.org. There's a donate button, and you can even be a member of the association for $35 a year. And that helps show our strength to all sorts of people that we are a public organization and we don't just represent Indian country, but we represent everyone, and our allies are included in our membership. So thank you all for this evening, and we'll see you all next week. Remember, we're all related, everything is connected, and you are sacred. Yakoki.